Hey there. Welcome to Conscious Living with Irene Alexandra. I'm Irene, and I'm so glad you're here for this episode. The Conscious Living podcast is all about exploring the art of living consciously, how to reconnect with the magic that's already within you, and create a more mindful, intentional life. You're tuning into season 1, where we begin the journey of becoming a conscious educator. This season is packed with insights and practical strategies for teachers who want to transform their approach to teaching, better understand their students, and cultivate a more mindful, empowered classroom. Each episode will equip you with tools to bring more presence, awareness, and intention into your teaching. While this season is dedicated to educators, I firmly believe that anyone can benefit from this season, whether you're in education or not. As always, new episodes are released on Sundays. You can find the full season 1 guide on my website, irenealexandra.com. Take a look, see which episodes you're most excited to listen to, and be sure to share them with others who may enjoy or benefit from them as well. Now, a little housekeeping before we get to the good stuff. Please remember that this podcast is for educational purposes only. It's as if we're sitting on your back porch, sipping some freshly brewed coffee, and chatting about the complexities of life. I am not a medical or psychological professional, so please seek professional help if and when needed. That said, I have spent over a decade in education as a teacher, school leader, and teacher coach and mentor, specializing in special education and reading in early childhood through 8th grade. But I've also taught general education and gifted programs. I've also been a student of psychology and behavioral sciences for longer than I've been teaching. My interest in that was sparked when I was growing up, and it was reignited when I first started teaching. I immediately knew that the status quo of teaching was not for me. I wanted to dig deeper, to know better, and to do better. For more information about me and my personal and professional background, visit my website to get to know me more. Also, don't forget to get your free podcast playbook to accompany this podcast on my website, irenealexandra.com. The podcast playbook includes all the key points from today's episode, along with visuals of reflection questions and extra resources to help you follow along. My episodes are usually jam-packed with information, so I created this resource to better support your learning and understanding. I personally learn best with visuals and something to engage with while I listen. So if you're like me, this will be super helpful. Just head to my website and search for the title of this episode, and your free podcast playbook will pop right up, along with all of the ones from previous episodes. Again, my website is irenealexandra.com, and it can also be found in the description. Finally, if you're curious about working with me or exploring my current offerings, check out the description or head to my website for all of the details. Now, let's get into it. Have you ever taught the unspoken curriculum? It's not the lesson plan or the test prep. It's not their ABCs or 1, 2, 3s or DoReMis. It's in between all of that. It's the human component to teaching. It's the deep, lasting impact that your teaching has on your students' brains, behavior, and future. In this episode, we'll dive into how your teaching style, your discipline approach, and your energy shapes your students' long-term growth in ways that you might not even realize. Let's begin with the neuroplasticity of discipline as we explore whether you're helping to shape your students' minds or unintentionally shutting them down. Discipline is a necessary but widely misunderstood practice. When you think of discipline, you might have flashbacks to childhood experiences writing, "I won't hit again," 100 times until your fingers bleed, or being smacked with a wooden spoon or belt, or standing silently in a corner for hours on end. Or perhaps you've seen, heard, or even participated in outdated discipline practices in schools, such as publicly shaming students for their behavior, enforcing silent lunches as punishment, or sending students out of class with no real purpose, structure, or follow-up. But here's the truth. Those are absolutely not examples of discipline. What they are, however, are forms of control through fear. And in many cases, they are abuse disguised as behavior management. Now, you might think discipline means being able to control student behavior. Getting your class to function like a well-oiled machine, well, that's still not what discipline is. So, what is discipline? Before we dive into what discipline should look like, let's clear this up. True discipline, when practiced consciously, is not about control or punishment. It's not reactive or a fear-based tactic. It's about guiding students towards making better, healthier choices for themselves and those around them. It's about helping to build the emotional, mental, social, and psychological skills they need to thrive. Now, allow me to introduce the type of discipline I've found to be the most effective, supportive, and transformative: conscious discipline. This approach, which you'll hear mentioned not just throughout this episode, but throughout my entire podcast, is a proactive and empowering way to manage classrooms as well as home environments. It's rooted in fostering genuine connection, modeling emotional regulation, and building an environment where students feel safe enough to grow, both academically and emotionally, as their own human selves. But here's the real power of conscious discipline. It's not just about correcting behavior. It's about rewiring the brain for resilience, cultivating self-regulation, and nurturing empathy. When applied with intention, discipline stops being reactive and becomes a purposeful tool for shaping not only your students' actions, but also their long-term emotional well-being and success in their own life. This is part of that unspoken curriculum. But we'll save this conscious discipline deep dive for another episode. Right now, let's talk about how conscious discipline connects to neuroplasticity and why that's such a game changer. As we've discussed in a previous episode, neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change, rewire, and reorganize itself based on what we experience. Using our previous analogy, think of neuroplasticity as the character Doctor Strange. At the start of his journey, he's rigid, relying on his old ways of thinking and doing. But as he learns to adapt, expand his mind, and embrace new possibilities, he undergoes a transformation that mirrors how our brains can rewire themselves. Just like Dr. Strange learns to see beyond what he once thought possible, neuroplasticity helps our brains form new connections and pathways, allowing us to grow and change even when things seem set in stone. It's all about adaptability, learning, and reshaping our mental world. Now, when we think about discipline in the classroom, we often focus on behavior in that moment, such as getting students to follow directions, stay on task, or resolve conflicts. But what's far too often overlooked, among other things, such as how all behavior is a form of communication and how there is always a root cause to behavior, but those discussions are for another episode. What is far too often overlooked is how the way we discipline actually shapes our students' brains over time. And yes, I mean literally shape their brains. This is where neuroplasticity comes into play. Knowing how neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to rewire itself based on experiences, let's leverage that to support our students' growth and development. Consider how every interaction, every consequence, every moment of connection or disconnection sends messages to a child's brain about how to respond to the world. Think of discipline as either reinforcing pathways that lead to fear, shame, and avoidance, or creating new pathways that foster resilience, self-regulation, and problem solving. Now, remember Mr. Hurricane? Let's go back to his classroom. Mr. Hurricane is in the middle of a riveting lecture about the proper use of a semicolon when all of a sudden, one of his students disrupts class by shouting out. However, the student wasn't actually trying to be funny or disruptive. They were genuinely excited about the topic and eager to contribute. But Mr. Hurricane, without missing a beat, turns sharply toward the student and says loudly, "Really? Are you going to interrupt me like that? Maybe next time you can teach a lesson since you clearly know everything." And then he adds, "One more outburst and I'll send you to the office." In that moment, the student may feel embarrassed ashamed, and even confused about why their excitement was met with such anger and hostility. If this kind of interaction happens repeatedly, the student's brain could begin to associate curiosity and enthusiasm with rejection or fear. Those neural pathways, initially sparked by excitement and interest, begin to rewire, teaching the student to suppress their passion for learning rather than express it. Over time, this student may stop engaging altogether, not because they don't care, but because their brain has learned that it's safer to stay quiet than to risk being called out or shut down. This is the power of neuroplasticity in action, reinforcing connections based on repeated experiences, for better or, in this case, for worse. Now, let's go back to Mrs. Sunshine's classroom. It's the same setting. Mrs. Sunshine is also in the middle of a lesson about the proper use of a semicolon. It was a good day that day, clearly, when one of her students suddenly shouts out. Again, the student wasn't trying to disrupt the class. They were genuinely excited and couldn't contain their enthusiasm about the proper use of semicolons. Instead of reacting with frustration and empty threats, Mrs. Sunshine pauses, takes a quick, calming breath, tilts her head to the side while showing a gentle smile at the student. She says, "I love how excited you are about this, but remember to raise your hand or wait for a natural pause if you want to chime in. Let me finish my thought first, and then I'll call on you to share yours." The student is feeling seen and valued rather than shamed and nods eagerly and waits for their turn. When Mrs. Sunshine circles back to the student, she encourages them to share, reinforcing their enthusiasm and channeling it into a productive and respectful contribution. In this moment, Mrs. Sunshine has done something extremely powerful. Instead of triggering the student's fight, flight, or freeze response, she has strengthened neural pathways associated with safety, connection, and curiosity. Over time, the student's brain learns that their excitement for learning is something to be celebrated, not stifled. By modeling emotional regulation and addressing the behavior with empathy and intention, Mrs. Sunshine has not only redirected the moment, but she has also contributed to wiring the student's brain for resilience, confidence, and a true love of learning. Not to mention that she's absolutely killing it at teaching the unspoken curriculum. Now, let's break down the differences in discipline. I've created two buckets of discipline for the purpose of this conversation. The first bucket is conscious discipline, and the second is punitive discipline. These are both labeled as forms of discipline, but they lead students down two very different paths. One path leads to growth and creates a lifelong learner. The other path leads to shutdown and blocks the potential for creating a lifelong learner. Punitive discipline, which is inherently reactive, often comes from a place of frustration, anger, or a lack of knowledge on the adult's behalf, with little to no forethought or proactive efforts to support student development and growth. This kind of discipline, like yelling, shaming, inappropriate consequences, using empty threats, inappropriate language, or using physical punishment, triggers the body's stress response. I also want to add that not using language or consequences that are developmentally appropriate are in this category as well. We say that we want to create lifelong learners. However, punitive discipline rewires the brain to fear curiosity, mistakes, and growth, the very foundations of learning. Over time, this increases stress hormones, which impacts brain function and can also significantly impact their physical health in the long term, including potentially leading to adverse coping skills such as addictions. This type of stress makes it harder for children to regulate their emotions or think clearly, especially without any guidance or modeling on how to do those things at all. The chronic stress from this type of discipline affects the prefrontal cortex. Remember, the CEO that controls decision making and impulse control. Meanwhile, the amygdala, the bouncer, Big Amy, who's in charge of the brain's alert center, becomes overactive, causing kids to feel anxious, fearful, and less likely to trust authority figures, including teachers. When discipline is reactive like this, it focuses more on fear and control rather than actual teaching and understanding, which then leads to emotional shutdown rather than growth. On the other hand, conscious discipline is proactive. Instead of reacting in the moment, it's about proactively supporting and teaching children to learn to manage their emotions and make thoughtful and healthy choices for themselves and those around them before a potential issue comes up. This approach focuses on emotional regulation, self-control, awareness, and critical thinking. Conscious discipline creates neural pathways that equate learning with joy and curiosity, nurturing emotional safety and inspiring a mindset of growth, laying the foundation for lifelong learners. When children are met with calm, redirection, predictable systems and structures. I'm going to say that part one more time because it's so important. Predictable systems and structures. Restorative practices, and logical consequences. They're given tools to reflect on their actions and understand the impact of their behavior and grow emotionally. Over time, this approach strengthens neural pathways that help children regulate their emotions and think critically. It builds resilience, teaches problem solving, and supports positive relationships. The difference is clear. Punitive discipline, when used repeatedly, creates fear-based pathways in the brain that make it harder for children to process emotions, make decisions, most notably healthy decisions, and actively blocks them from becoming lifelong learners. Conscious discipline, on the other hand, helps develop emotional resilience and empowers children to regulate their emotions, solve problems, trust themselves and others, and it actively supports them to become lifelong learners. We'll dive deeper into conscious discipline practices in a future episode. Now, let's discuss how a teacher's energy shapes their students' inner voice and their brain. I'm sure you personally have had moments where you've walked into a room and immediately felt the energy of it. Maybe it was heavy, or maybe it was light and joyful. You just knew, without anyone saying anything, exactly what kind of vibe that room had. Maybe you've been in a situation where someone was upset, and even if they didn't say a word, you could feel it, almost like the emotion was hanging in the air. Or maybe you've been in a room where people were talking about you behind your back, and somehow you could sense it when you walked in, even before you had any evidence. It's not what's being said, it's the energy. And then there are those situations where you pick up on someone not being fully honest with you. What they're saying might seem perfectly fine on the surface, but you feel that something's off. You feel it in your gut. You sense potentially manipulation or covert intentions, and nothing else they do or say can shake that feeling. It's the energy behind what they're saying and doing that communicates the truth, even if they're trying to hide it. You might think to yourself, how can no one else see this? How can they not feel it? This is where we start to touch on the concept of energy, those unspoken yet very real forces that shape how we experience people, spaces, and interactions, much like our unspoken curriculum. You've likely felt this dynamic with your coworkers too. For instance, according to the Journal of Clinical Psychology, 1 in 6 people exhibit narcissistic traits. Narcissism itself is a very complex and often misunderstood topic, capable of leaving lasting psychological, mental, and emotional scars on those who encounter people with narcissistic traits. Teaching is already an incredibly demanding profession. You're balancing diverse student needs, addressing systemic dysfunctions, and trying to compensate for the many shortcomings of the education system. Any one of these challenges is enough to stretch you unbearably thin. But then add the emotional labor of navigating toxic personality traits in the workplace, and it becomes too overwhelming. These negative interactions don't just impact you, they ripple out, affecting your coworkers, students, and even their families. That's why it's so important for educators to educate themselves about personality types and disorders. When you understand these dynamics, you're less likely to get caught in the traps set by potentially manipulative individuals or energy vampires. This awareness isn't just about self protection, it helps you conserve your energy and stay focused on what truly matters: your students and your peace. Also, these interactions don't just exist on the surface. They ripple through our emotions, shaping our mental and psychological state and influencing how we show up in the world. This leads us to the concept of emotional contagions. The idea that energy and emotions are inherently contagious, spreading from one person to another like an unseen force. Here's something critical to keep in mind: emotions are not just feelings, they are energy in motion. While we'll explore this concept more deeply in a future episode, understanding that emotions and energy are intimately connected is essential for the conversation ahead. So, how does all of this tie into your classroom? Well, just like you can feel the energy of a room, your students can feel your energy, your emotional state, your intentions, the tone you set. All of that creates the energy of your classroom. And whether it's calm and supportive or tense and reactive, your energy has a profound impact on your students' inner world, including the way that they think about themselves and how their brains develop. This is where emotional contagions come in. And if you're not familiar, let's quickly revisit what that means. Essentially, the idea that emotions are contagious. What the teacher feels, the students feel, and vice versa. Remember the Taylor Swift example I gave from a previous episode? Think of emotional contagion like the energy at one of her concerts. Before Taylor even hits the stage, the excitement is already building as fans swap bracelets and buzz with anticipation. Then, when she steps out, the crowd erupts and the energy bounces back and forth between Taylor and the audience, creating a shared emotional experience. Whether you're inside of the stadium or outside in the parking lot, you can feel that energy ripple through the air. It is palpable. This is exactly how emotional contagion works. Our emotions spread to those around us. So in the classroom, a teacher's emotions can have a direct impact on students. If the teacher is stressed, the students will feel it. But if the teacher is calm and positive, that energy is reflected back in the students calmly and positively. Now, imagine you're sitting in Mr. Hurricane's class. He walks in, papers flying everywhere, rushing around, checking the clock like he's already late for something. His voice is sharp and quick. You can feel the pressure in the air. It's like the room's full of static electricity just waiting to zap you. You can almost feel his stress creeping up on you. And before you know it, you're zapped with that same static electricity, feeling jittery or starting to zone out. It's like when someone walks into a room upset and suddenly everyone feels off. It's a vibe that you just can't shake. That's emotional contagion at play. Mr. Hurricane's frantic energy spreads through the room, affecting everyone's mood and focus without anyone even saying a word. When a teacher's energy is more like Mr. Hurricane's, full of stress, frustration, or anxiety, that can send the whole class into a spiral. Students might start to feel anxious, distracted, or shut down. It's like when you're in a room where everyone is tense or on edge. You can't focus on anything else because you're trying to manage the energy around you. When a teacher's energy is erratic or negative, it distracts students from the task at hand and can create feelings of insecurity, confusion, or even fear. This can affect their ability to process information, make decisions, or even connect with their peers. In these types of environments, emotional regulation becomes much harder and learning suffers as a result. Now, picture that you're in Mrs. Sunshine's class. She walks in with a big, warm smile, and the whole room just feels warmer and cozier. She greets everyone calmly, checks in with a few students to make sure they're doing okay, and starts the lesson with a relaxed energy. There's a sense of ease in the air. It's like the room is filled with sunshine and warmth, and it starts to spread, even to the students who might be feeling a little off themselves. Everyone seems to gently settle in, focusing on the lesson, maybe even feeling a little lighter or more balanced. It's like when you walk into a room and someone's in a good mood or has this wonderfully infectious personality, and suddenly you can't help but smile too. It's like when you're really angry and you don't want to smile, but someone really makes you smile and they kind of bring that energy out of you. Similar kind of example. But that's emotional contagion at work again. Mrs. Sunshine's calm, positive energy spreads throughout the class, helping everyone feel more focused, relaxed, and ready to learn. So, when a teacher like Mrs. Sunshine brings that calm, positive energy into the room, it creates an environment where students feel safe, relaxed, and open to learning. Students are more likely to stay focused, take risks in their learning, and engage in the lesson. She's not just teaching the academic curriculum here, she's fully committing to the unspoken curriculum through her warm and stable energy. It's like when you're around someone who's positive and grounded, you feel more confident and comfortable just being yourself, which is sometimes one of the hardest things to do. When the teacher's energy is balanced and calm, the students' brains can focus on what's actually happening in the classroom and not the tension in the air. This allows for deeper learning, better emotional regulation, and stronger relationships between teachers and students. The energy is contagious, but in the best possible way. Now, let's wrap up this section with a quick note on emotional awareness. This is a topic I want to talk forever about, so I'm definitely going to create another episode for this because it's so important for teachers, as this is definitely not taught during professional development week or during teacher trainings. Emotional awareness for teachers is so much more than just a quick fix like meditation, yoga class, wellness days, or anything that the school can provide, respectfully. It's an ongoing journey of self reflection, emotional regulation, shadow work, and deep psychological or trauma or ancestral healing. It can start with identifying your triggers, understanding what sets you off, maybe a student behavior, so that you can address the root cause instead of just reacting impulsively in the moment. It's also about practicing self compassion, recognizing when you're overwhelmed, and giving yourself space and grace rather than being your own harshest critic when it comes to self growth and development. It's about being mindful of your emotions and taking that mental pause before reacting, which gives you the space to respond intentionally and not out of frustration. You've got to own your own energy. Checking in with yourself throughout the day to see how your mood is affecting the classroom helps to prevent negative energy from spreading. Seeking support from a mentor, therapist, psychologist, psychologist, or a trusted friend or family member is key, as emotional awareness, which often involves deep psychological healing and shadow work, can be so tough to develop solo. It could also be worthwhile to invest in a professional development course or session focused on emotional intelligence and classroom culture, which could be incredibly valuable. These strategies aren't just about getting through the day. They're about building a deeper connection with yourself and understanding of your emotions and energy, and ultimately then leading to creating a more positive and supportive classroom environment for everyone. Again, you are the mirror for your classroom. So the more healing and support you give yourself, the more it will show up for your students. Again, we'll dive deeper into this conversation in a future episode. I am genuinely excited for that one. All right. So, as we recap this episode and discuss some key takeaways, like before, I want to remind you that the examples I use are intentionally simplified. Real life is so much more complex, and I'm fully aware of that. I'm sharing these examples for illustration purposes only. Talking is difficult for me today. Please excuse that. I keep tripping over myself, especially when it comes to the end of these episodes. Also, while we didn't specifically or in too much detail discuss academic success in this episode, I do want to emphasize that everything we've talked about today absolutely impacts student learning and achievement. That will be a conversation for another time as well. So, throughout today's episode, we discussed some aspects of the unspoken curriculum. Specifically, we discussed the differences in approach and impact of conscious discipline versus punitive discipline as we connected it to neuroplasticity. We saw how conscious discipline is rooted in emotional awareness and mindful responses, how it nurtures the student's brain development and helps to build their inner voice in a positive direction, while punitive discipline can shut down that growth, reinforcing negative patterns in both the brain and emotional regulation. We also explored how a teacher's energy, whether calm and grounded like Mrs. Sunshine or frazzled like Mr. Hurricane, affects not just the classroom environment in the present, but also the long-term emotional and cognitive development of their students. By being mindful of both the discipline strategies you use and the energy you bring to the classroom, you're not just guiding behavior, you are actively shaping the neural pathways and inner voices of your students. Now, let's get into your weekly challenge. This week, you are to focus on one small moment each day. This could be as simple and small as a passing comment, or a quick touch on the shoulder, or a smile to a struggling student. You're going to reflect on that moment and how it impacted both your mood and theirs. This could be a positive moment or a negative moment, or both. It's really your choice. You can reflect mentally, you can write it down in your journal or on the notes app on your phone. You can meditate about it, you can do artwork about it, whatever works for you. At the end of the week, identify which moments of emotional connection had the most lasting and meaningful and positive impact. See if you can start to identify and experience how these small and seemingly insignificant moments add up to shaping your students' emotional regulation and self-worth. Is this a lesson you'd consider adding to your unspoken curriculum? I'd love to hear your thoughts on our social media platforms. Those details are in the description. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe, or whatever is fitting for the platform that you are listening to me on so you don't miss an episode of Conscious Living with Irene Alexandra. Remember to be the light that helps others see the light within themselves. I'll see you next time.